My name is Tim Clemens, and I'm delighted that you're tuning in for today. Hey, today we're talking about wrath or anger, as it's sometimes called. And I reckon if you had to ask someone to rank the 7 deadly sins in order of most deadly, I think most people would probably put wrath somewhere near the top, if not the top. Why? Well, it's kind of self-evident, isn't it? Right? Wrath is deadly to other people. And so, for example, growing up, my family had, we knew someone, and frankly, he was kind of a nice guy. But as it turned out, he discovered that his wife was having an affair. He murdered his wife and the wife's lover. Right? Wrath can turn a nice guy into a murderer. This is partly why many criminal justice systems will have kind of make a distinction between crimes of passion and premeditated crimes. Premeditated ones are the ones you think about in advance and you plan, whereas crimes of passion is those moments where, or at least as the defense goes, you're so overwhelmed and overcome with a certain kind of emotion that you just do something that you'd never do in your right mind. Because that's the extreme end of the spectrum. Right, most of us, even if we're not going to go to that extreme, know that wrath has a way of causing us to do things and say things, or sometimes not do and not say things that hurt and harm those who are closest to us, whether it's our spouse, our partner, our family, or our friends. And so wrath is rightly called, I think, a deadly sin because it's deadly to others. The thing is, it's also deadly to ourselves. Frederick Buechner once wrote this about wrath. He said, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontation still to come, to savour to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it's a feast fit for a king, but listen to this. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. See, there's 2 ways that we can express anger. As one author put it, we can either stew or spew. When you stew in your anger, there may be a kind of perverted pleasure that comes with that. But as Frederick Buechner says, at the end of the day, you're only destroying yourself because the skeleton at the feast is you. And so again, I think most people understand why wrath is considered one of the 7 deadly sins and perhaps even the most deadly. Where things get slightly complicated, however, is when you start to realize that in the Bible, God is described as angry. So, for example, take a look at what Moses says to God in Exodus 32, verse 12. He says, "Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people." Right? If a perfect and holy God can be described as angry, then it must be the case that anger in and of itself isn't necessarily sinful. And furthermore, if a perfect, holy, and righteous God can get angry, then that must mean that the right response to certain things must be anger. Now, maybe you say at that point, well, hang on, that's God, Tim. Surely different rules apply between God and us. Well, have a listen to what Paul the Apostle says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 6. He says, "In your anger, do not sin." Right? The implication of that verse seems to be that you can be angry and yet not sinfully so, all of which kind of raises some interesting questions about anger's place among the 7 deadly sins. Now, one of the ways that people have tried to address this issue is by drawing a distinction between anger and wrath. And so maybe wrath is the sinful version, anger is the rightful version. Now, in some ways, I appreciate the desire to categorize things and just make things simple. The slight challenge, though, is that it's almost more neat than the Bible is, because the Bible doesn't use that distinction anywhere near as clearly. So, for example, take a look at what Moses says to the people of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 8. He says to them, "At Horeb, you aroused the Lord's wrath so that he was angry enough to destroy you." Right? Both of those 2 words are basically used interchangeably. In the Bible, wrath and anger effectively refer to the same thing. And as we've seen, there seems to be a righteous, and we all know from experience there's also an unrighteous kind of anger. So where does that leave us? Well, today I want to try and do 4 things. I know, controversial, but they all alliterate, so it's okay. I want to do 4 things with you. Number 1, I want to explore the purpose of anger. What was it made for? Why can we get angry? Second of all, I want to explore the problems with anger. In other words, where does our sin twist and distort our anger so it goes bad? Third, I want to explore the power of anger and see what it reveals about what's going on in our heart. And then fourth and finally, I want to prescribe some solutions for anger. So that is the purpose, the problems, the power, and then some prescriptions. How about we jump in first of all with the purpose of anger? C.S. Lewis wrote a space trilogy called Perelandra. In the second of the books, he has his main character, a guy named Elwyn Ransom, go head-to-head with an evil villain named Weston. Now, as you would imagine, the hero ends up winning the head-to-head battle. But just listen to something that C.S. Lewis says that the hero feels in his body or at the start of the battle. Because he felt what perhaps no good man can ever have in our world, right? The world of the reader. A torrent of perfectly unmixed and lawful hatred. This filled Ransom not with horror, but with a kind of joy. The joy came from finding at last what hatred was made for. Isn't that a fascinating little phrase, what hatred was made for? When he sees before him almost the embodiment of evil, evil personified, he says, I saw what hatred was made for. It was made for this, something like this. Now, what would happen if we applied that phrase to anger? What was anger made for? See, it's clear, isn't it, that God has made human beings with the capacity to get angry. We all experience it. We can get angry. Furthermore, anger, a little bit like sexual desire, is a profoundly physical thing. That's partly why it's sometimes called a passion. It affects the whole body. But again, why is it that way? Why has God made us such that it affects our body? Well, let's use sexual desire just for a moment. In the sovereignty of God, sexual desire has been designed to bring a man and a woman together in marriage and then keep them together in marriage as they raise and nurture children to know and love the Lord. But what about anger? Why has God made anger? What's its purpose? Well, as we answer this question, I think probably what we need to go do is go and look at Jesus. After all, Jesus was the Son of God, so he's divine, but he's also fully human. And therefore, Jesus models for us and shows us what it is to be truly and fully and perfectly human. And so if we can see what Jesus got angry at, and furthermore what his anger prompted him to do, we'll have a bit of a clue as to the purpose of anger. So we had this read out for us before. It's from Mark 3. Basically, Jesus walks into a synagogue that's like an old Jewish church, or I guess a modern Jewish church as well, really. He walks into a synagogue. It's the Sabbath. Typically, you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath, but most importantly, he meets a man with a shriveled hand. Now, just for context, in the synagogue are some religious leaders named Pharisees. Jesus has already had a couple of rounds worth of discussions with these guys as to what's lawful to do on the Sabbath. Can you work? Can you not? What to do? Anyway, take a look at what happens when Jesus walks in and asks the man with the shriveled hand to stand up. It's from Mark chapter 3, verse 4 to 6. It says, Then Jesus asked them, Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, Stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees, that's the religious leaders, went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. I want you to notice 2 little things from that episode. First, notice what got Jesus angry. Right, what Jesus gets angry at is the fact that the Pharisees were failing to love God and failing to love their neighbor. I mean, think about it. Their obsession with the Sabbath and what you could and couldn't do was far more about their own pride and religious self-righteousness than it was springing from any love for God, who apparently set the rule. Second of all, the fact that they didn't want this man to get healed and were so obsessed with the Sabbath shows that they had no love for him either. Right? That is what makes Jesus angry. They're failing to love God and they're failing to love neighbor. Anger, you could say, is the right response to a failure to love God and a failure to love neighbor. Thomas Aquinas said, anger's rightful target is injustice. I think that works. Injustice to God, injustice to neighbor. Furthermore, though, I think most of us can probably appreciate the fact that Jesus' anger is a right response to injustice. But just think about it for a moment. Imagine if instead of getting angry and distressed at their hardness of hearts, Jesus walks in, kind of shrugs, heals the man's hand, and then walks out yawning. That is a very different kind of Jesus, isn't it? Right? You look at Jesus doing that, and you sort of ask yourself, does he even care? I mean, seriously, what's going on? You see, Grace City, sometimes it's easy to assume if you don't get angry all that often, that that's really godly. Maybe. But anger can be, careful, a form of godliness. And so a lack of anger isn't necessarily a sign of godliness. It may, in fact, be a sign of cold-hearted apathy. Anger shows that we care enough for evil to bother us. And so, again, I think Jesus shows us the right response of anger. Anger is the right response to a lack of love for God, love for neighbor, or if you like, just injustice. This is the first thing I want you to notice about Jesus. Second thing I want you to notice, though, is what his anger actually prompts him to do. Because you notice he doesn't just heal the guy's hand, though obviously he does. In the process of healing the guy's hand, though, he stands up to the probably fair degree of intimidation from the Pharisees. In other words, Jesus' anger prompts him to stand up to injustice. He cares for the powerless. He stands up and challenges the hypocrisy of the leaders. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if his anger in part actually helped him to do that. Almost, if I could put it this way, gave him the courage to stand up to them. Let's listen to how Rebecca Cater Young puts it. She says, anger can be our ally in action by helping us deal with both inner and outer difficulties that could discourage us from pursuing what's right. Someone who would otherwise be too shy may need the push of anger to stand up and speak out when he needs to defend the downtrodden. Someone who would otherwise feel too weak may fight beyond the limit of her power if anger fires her spirit. Now, whether that's exactly what happened with Jesus isn't the point, though I suspect it probably did happen with Jesus. The point is what it shows us about the purpose of anger. Right? Anger is the right response to lack of love for God, but also Jesus' anger prompts him to do something about it. It's the right response to injustice, and anger, rightly seen, prompts you to do something about that injustice. Now, as we're going to see in a moment, that can go terribly wrong. But that doesn't mean that anger always in and of itself is wrong. Actually, anger, righteous anger, can in fact be a good gift from God given to further the cause of justice in his broken world. I mean, let's face it, let's thank God that guys like William Wilberforce got angry at slavery, that people like Martin Luther King got angry at racism, that Mother Teresa got angry at poverty. Because God can and has used anger to further the cause of justice in his world. I think that's the purpose of anger. But let's now shift and think, what are the problems? Because for everything we've seen about how anger can be good, the reality is that most of our anger, frankly, doesn't fit into the category of good like we've just described. Actually, sin tends to twist and distort it such that our anger goes terribly wrong. Our anger goes wrong either because we get angry about the wrong things, or maybe we get angry about the right things, but we do it in the wrong way. See, think about the wrong things for a moment. How much of your anger is prompted by genuine injustice, and how much is actually just prompted by, a threat to your ego or something like that? I mean, maybe you get angry when your agenda for the day is frustrated by an unexpected interruption. or when someone cuts in on you in the traffic, or when your kids take longer than you expect them or want them to, either getting out of the bath, having their dinner, getting changed, something like that. Or when your ridiculously high expectations aren't met by another mere mortal at work, right? None of those things are really all about injustice, are they? And yet these are the things that on a daily basis provoke us to get angry. Right, so we can get angry about the wrong things, but we can also get angry about the right things in the wrong ways, because we either get angry too quickly, too much, or we hold on to the anger for too long. If you think about the person who gets angry too quickly, you notice this, right? They walk around like a coiled spring, ready to unload on the first poor unsuspecting victim that seems to threaten their sense of justice. Proverbs 29 verse 22 says, "An angry person stirs up conflict, and a hot-tempered person commits many sins." When was the last time your hot temper actually helped a situation? But even when someone else has actually committed a genuine offense, it almost never helps for you to just blow up in the moment. Right? Even God, think about God. We've said God can and does get righteously angry. His anger is good and right and true, and yet he always describes himself as slow to anger. The reality is we've all had our moments where we get angry embarrassingly quickly, especially when we're hungry or we're tired. No one likes being hangry. But if anger has become a habit for you, a vice that has kind of through repetition been worn into your soul, then you got to address that. Your anger is not only not advancing the cause of justice, it's also causing everyone around you to have to walk on eggshells. It's unloving to God and it's unloving to them. The second common mistake with anger is when you get angry too much. You're too angry about something. Now, let's face it, having what we've just said, it's okay to get angry to a degree if someone slights your reputation or says something hurtful and harmful to you. That's okay. But it is interesting, isn't it? How we often get 100 times angry about stuff like that than we do about far more significant injustices in the world. I mean, just think about this week for a moment. How did you respond to the news coming out of Afghanistan? Does it anger you that lives are in danger and that some people have already been murdered in cold blood? Now, maybe you're like, it's a mile away. It's miles and miles and miles away. What about stuff closer to home that happens in Australia on a daily basis? Things like abortion, domestic violence, racism. Now again, they're out there. There's stuff that happens in your life, I'm sure, where genuine injustice is taking place. But why is it that we so regularly seem far more concerned with a threat to our reputation than a threat to the life of others? If that's your experience, it's a good sign that maybe your heart is not calibrated the way it needs to be to what genuine injustice is really about. Garret Keizer, speaking of Jesus, says this. He says, "Smite him on the cheek and he turns you the other. Slap the dignity of the house of prayer, however, and he'll turn over a table." Right, that is a heart correctly calibrated. The final way that anger goes wrong is when we hold on to it for too long. In other words, rather than forgiving someone, we kind of nurse our grudges and get bitter and resentful towards them. Now, part of what makes this so unhelpful, though, is that it tends to leave us more vulnerable to the first two errors that we explored. Right? Think about it. Oftentimes, the reason that someone is quick to become angry and then explodes on the other person when they do become angry is because they're reacting not to the moment, but to old hurts, right? They've nursed their grudges, and that's what's coming out. Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 9, I'm quoting from the ESV, says this: "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry." Listen to this. "For anger lodges in the heart of fools." Anger has a way of lodging in the heart. It's like food when you eat it. It lodges in your teeth. Every night, every morning, you got to have the discipline to scrub it away, or else it sort of grows and builds up plaque and all sorts of bad things happen. It's like that with anger. Anger lodges in the heart. And unless you get rid of it through forgiveness and pursuing reconciliation, it has a way of growing plaque on it, building up in our lives and poisoning us from the inside out. Until before you know it, you're sort of just getting angry all the time and too much and inappropriate ways and inappropriate places. So, there's some examples of how anger's purpose can also be problematized by sin. Before we move on, maybe just ask yourself the question, where are you most likely to get anger wrong? Is it because you're getting angry about the wrong stuff? Or is it because you get angry about the right stuff, but in the wrong way, either too much, too quickly, or you hold on to it for too long? I suspect it's probably a combination of all of those things. Now I want to, though, explore the power of anger. You see, I think anger is incredibly powerful in multiple ways, but I want to focus on two. The first is its negative power, very negative power. And then the second, there is power in observing what I'm going to explain. So let me get into it. Negatively, anger is powerful because it blinds us to the truth. It blinds us to the truth. You see, there's this little phrase when someone gets angry that they're seeing red. You know, envy, it's the green-eyed monster. Wrath, you're seeing red. We say that not just because sometimes our face gets red when we get angry, but because it's almost a reference to a chemical reaction that is going on in the body. Remember, we said anger is a profoundly physical thing. The scientists will tell us that anger is part of the fight response in our fight or flight reflex to danger and difficulty. The thing is, when that physical response prompts us to defend the powerless and fight for the cause of justice, it's a great thing. But as is often the case, when our anger is misdirected or too excessive, that physical response within us can actually be a profoundly unhelpful thing. Brian Hedges makes the point that it's this physical reaction dynamic to anger that may make it one of the hardest of the 7 deadly sins to actually admit as sinful. He kind of explains, look, the envious person is often miserable. The slothful person can sometimes be depressive. The gluttonous person might be embarrassed. But the angry person, well, yes, they're angry, but their anger feels so right, doesn't it? I mean, the others are like, maybe they can kind of come around to admit that they're wrong, but the angry person, there's something about being angry that just feels right because of what's happened in the moment. The problem is, the more angry you get, the more difficult it comes to distinguish between a genuine justice and self-justification. You know what that's like, don't you? Have you ever replayed an offense to you in the movie theater of your mind over and over again, maybe kind of selectively editing as you go? Maybe you've even walked into the imaginary courtroom in your mind and sort of declared yourself not guilty and sentenced some kind of vengeance against the other. One of the worst, probably the worst, I think, aspects of this dynamic is that anger can sometimes force us to demonize the other, those who've offended us. Because just think about it, it's a whole lot easier to get angry and then stay angry at someone that you've managed to forget is a fallible human being capable of making mistakes just like you can. It's much easier to get angry at someone once you've dehumanized them and reduced them away from the story of good and bad and everything they've done down to one single mistake or a string of mistakes and failures. Anger is dangerously powerful, Grace City, because it not only blinds us to the truth about right and wrong and our part in it, but also because it can demonize and dehumanize people, blinding us to the truth of their humanity. Now, before we move on to the next one, what do you do with this insight? What do you do with the power of anger to blind you to the truth? Well, how do you combat that insight? I think you take use of the insight and combat the power through increasingly telling yourself truth about the other person. So, for example, I went for a surf on Tuesday morning. It wasn't amazing waves, but I thought, hey, it's nice and sunny out, I'll give it a go. So I went out for a surf. And partway through the surf, there was another guy out there. I paddled for a wave, which he decided was his wave. And so he not only paddled for the wave as well, he also unloaded a whole bunch of expletives on me at the time. Now, unfortunately, that's not all that uncommon at certain beaches in the surf. But on this occasion, it actually left me feeling kind of pretty hurt, frankly, and also angry. But how did I respond? Well, obviously, I kind of knew that I was preaching on anger this week, so I thought better be on my best behavior. So what do? Well, in the moment, I sought to increasingly tell truth to myself about this guy who hurt me. I reminded myself he's a fallible human being. He's not perfect, neither am I. He's capable of making mistakes just like I am. Which then actually forced me to think, maybe I should open myself up to the possibility that I got it wrong. Maybe it was his wave after all, and I was wrong. And so in the end, I went up and apologized to him just in case. Now, in the end, it didn't go all that well anyway, but I guess what it helped me to do in the moment was remove some of the power of anger from my own life, and then also make sure that I was treating him like a fellow human being with dignity and respect. So there's kind of the first element of anger's power. Anger has the power to blind us to the truth, and the way we combat it is through truth-telling. But there is another power to anger, and that is that once you become aware of this, it reveals what you love. Anger reveals what you love. You see, many people assume that anger is the opposite of love. That's not true. Apathy is the opposite of love. Anger can actually sometimes be an expression of someone's love. C.S. Lewis once said that anger is what love bleeds when you cut it. Isn't that beautiful? Anger is what love bleeds when you cut it. Think back to what how Jesus reacted and what got him angry. Why did he get angry when the Pharisees failed to love God and love neighbor? Precisely because he loved God and neighbor so much. Right? Jesus got angry because he loved. It was a manifestation of his love. Now, in the case of Jesus, his anger revealed his righteous heart. But in the case of people like you and I, all too often our anger actually reveals the idols of our heart and the false identities we've built for ourselves. And so if you find yourself getting unduly angry at things like, when you're snubbed on social media, you get cut off in traffic, you go unrecognized for work, you have an idea shot down, like things like that. It's revealing that you kind of love yourself too much. Thomas Chalmers once wrote a famous sermon called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. His idea in the sermon was that if you want to get rid of one affection, don't just tell yourself that's a bad thing to love. What you need is a new affection, a new, more lovely thing to expulse. I don't know if that's a word, to get rid of that old affection, because your heart will latch onto a new and more worthy thing. Jonathan Parnell plays on that title and calls sinful anger the explosive power of a flawed affection. In other words, your flawed affection, when it comes under threat, you explode with anger. And so again, if you find yourself getting angry at things like snubbed on social media, being cut off in traffic, not being treated with the respect that you think you deserve, when your spouse underappreciates you, it's probably because you love yourself too much, right? In that moment, you are sensing that someone or something is coming between you and your prized status, security, or significance that you love so much. When they come in between you, they're threatening your love, and so the anger explodes. It's a flawed affection. So how is this a positive power? I say it's a positive power because once you become aware of what anger is doing, exposing your loves, it helps you to diagnose the idols of your heart. And so part of what I want you to do this week in the heart work is actually to keep a record of every time you get angry this week. And then at the end of the week, I want you to look back on all the episodes and ask yourself, what does that reveal about the deepest desires of my heart? What do I love, and what is anger exposing about that? Once you've done that, you can go the next step, which is to seek to set your heart's affection on something more lovely, like the glory of God and the good of others. Grace City, we've done the purpose, we've done the problems, we've done the power. Let's finish with some prescriptions. Because as we've said, for all the good things there is to anger, the truth is that pretty much all of ours is bad. And so how do we combat it? Well, it's interesting, James 1, 19-20, James says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry." Why? Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Interesting, the Bible doesn't tell us cultivate anger, the good kind. No. It says get rid of it, because 99.999% of the time, it's not going to bring the life that God requires. So, knowing what we do, how can we become people who, like God, are slow to anger? Well, let me suggest two things. Number one, practice gentleness. Practice gentleness. See, one of the things we explored in week 1 of this series was the way that each of the 7 deadly sins, if you kind of not just do them once, but they can kind of become a habitual vice for you. That is, you do them over and over again, and then they start to shape your character and start to mold you into the kind of person that vice is. You are a wrathful person. I think that's no truer than in the case of anger. It's interesting, think about Jesus for a moment. How would you describe Jesus? I mean, he got angry, didn't he? Right? We've already seen that. And his anger as well was true and right and good, but no one would call him an angry person. How would you describe Jesus? Well, oftentimes in the scriptures, he's called gentle. In Matthew 11:29, Jesus said, we saw this last week, "I am gentle and humble in heart." In 2 Corinthians 10 verse 1, Paul appeals to the Corinthians by the humility and gentleness of Jesus. Again, even though Jesus did get angry, that anger was always channeled through the filter of a gentle heart. So just think about his interaction with the Pharisees in Mark 3. Yes, he got angry, but how does the anger prompt him to respond? Well, he doesn't lash out with words, nor does he lash out with his actions and kind of hit them and beat them up. But neither does he step back and shrink off like a wimp. Instead, his anger, channeled through the heart of gentleness and the filter of gentleness, leads him to heal the man, stand up for injustice, and challenge the hypocrisy of the leaders. Right. Another reason to pursue gentleness is that gentleness can actually work to diffuse the anger of another and angry situations. And so, for example, Proverbs 15 verse 1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Now, that doesn't always work. On Tuesday, when I went and apologized to this guy, seeking to actually put this into practice, it didn't go too well. He swore at me and then paddled off. And so it's not a silver bullet. But what I have found is that those times where I am able to get control of my reaction, control of my emotions, rather than lashing out with a sharp word, if I can actually respond with gentleness, it goes a long way to diffusing what could otherwise be a really painful situation. But suppose you ask, well, Tim, this is all well and good. How do you become gentle, though? Well, I guess in some ways I want to say it's similar to last week. See, if you were tuning in last week, I said the way to combat the sin of sloth was to discipline yourself for godliness, or train yourself for godliness. Discipline, training, practice, gentleness. They're all words that kind of say the same thing. That is, you need practice at it. You may not be good at it to begin with, but through perseverance and repetition, you can get good at this. Practice gentleness. Let me give you an example. And just sorry that I'm going to use for 2 weeks in a row an example of where my wife has refined me like fire, but she's very good for my soul. Hey, when we got married, I was a slightly angry driver. Now, I'm not saying that I was an angry driver in the sense that I was swearing at everyone and honking my horn and all that sort of nonsense, but kind of slightly the more passive-aggressive kind. The kind that sort of gets really miffed when someone pulls in front of them without indicating, or someone doesn't let me in when I'm trying to merge in traffic, you blow up at that sort of stuff. The thing is, Emma just never let me get away with it. Now, I must confess, early on, I kind of thought she was overreacting. I was like, babe, did you see what that guy did? I mean, he didn't even indicate. But over time, I have actually come to see, you know what, she's right. All my road rage was just plain, pure ungodliness. And so with her help, sort of as an accountability partner in some ways, but through practice and repetition, I've become a far more gentle driver. Now, do I still get angry? Sure. But I don't think anyone these days would be an angry driver. It's just not part of my character when I'm behind the wheel anymore. Let me ask you, where do you need to practice gentleness? Is it with the kids? Is it with your spouse? Is it with your partner? Is it with your friends, your flatmates, your work colleagues? You want to combat anger? Prescription number 1, practice gentleness. Prescription number 2 is pursue forgiveness. Prescription number 2, pursue forgiveness. See, when we explored the problem with anger in point 2, we noted that one of the dangers of holding on to our anger is that it can lodge itself in the soul. As a result, we often then get angry too quickly or angry too much, too angry for the situation. When you forgive someone, though, it's like you're dislodging the anger from your soul. You're cleaning it out. You're getting rid of it. Now, depending on who it is that you're forgiving and what you're forgiving, it's not to say it's not going to still leave a scar. It may, and that scar may still hurt for some time. Furthermore, it's not to say that forgiveness just pretends as if it wasn't actually injustice, just sweeps it under the rug. No. Actually, one of the prerequisites to receive the gift of forgiveness is to admit that you've done something wrong that requires forgiving. Right? The gift of forgiveness stings before it heals. And so it's not to pretend that nothing has happened. Rather, when you give the gift of forgiveness, what you're doing is giving up your anger and your right to vengeance. Now, whether you are hoping that vengeance might take the form of a cruel murder or simply a cold shoulder, forgiveness says, I'm not going to take that. That belongs to God, not to me, and so I'm not stepping forward in that way. The thing is, like gentleness, practicing and pursuing forgiveness can be really hard. Now, this is a talk on anger, not forgiveness, so I can't say everything I'd want to, but I think probably the number one way to grow in your willingness to forgive others is to experience the forgiveness of God. You see, when you just think for a moment about your offense to God through your sin, that pales into insignificance. Let me flip that. I got that wrong. When you think about all the sin that others have done to you and the offense that they've given, it pales into insignificance compared to the offense and the sin that you've offered to God. I mean, you want to think about, just for a moment, you want to talk about the purpose of anger? The purpose of anger is God, the right response of a holy and righteous God against the sin of people like you and I that dwells in our heart. Right? What is that anger supposed to prompt him to do? It's supposed to prompt God to punish and judge evil once and for all. That is the purpose of anger in God. But what actually happens? Well, in the gospel, because God is loving and forgiving and slow to anger, I don't think you've understood it properly. This quote from Brian Hedges: God's love and forgiveness are powerful enough to quench the flames of your hot temper or melt the glacier of your cold and bitter heart. Embracing a life of forgiveness means embracing God's forgiveness and allowing the power of his grace to transform you so that you gradually become an ever more merciful and forgiving person. Grace City, prescription number 2, you want to combat anger? Pursue forgiveness. First, forgiveness from God. Because having pursued that will do a work in your heart and enable you to give it to others. Let me close. As I close, let me remind you of the heart work. If today you're tuning in for one of the first times, the heart work, it's not homework. We call it heart work because at the end of each one of these talks, I'm offering and encouraging you to go and do a bunch of stuff which I think is going to help you practice what we're talking about and take the truths that we've discussed and impress them deeply upon your hearts. If you want access to that, then at 8 p.m. tonight, you will get an email if we have your email address. If we don't, fill out a connection card and we'll add you to the list. If you can't wait that long, then just jump onto the website. We're having a little bit of difficulty with the website, but it is up there under, I think it's the What's On tab. You'll see Roth Heartwork as one of the options that you can pick. Maybe it's resources, but it'll be there. Grace City, why don't you join me? Let's pray. Lord God and Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are slow to anger and abounding in love, compassionate and merciful. We thank you that you do not treat us as our sins deserve. And rather than pouring out upon us your righteous anger, you instead make a way through your to trust in him. We might be treated with gentleness and be offered and receive the gift of forgiveness. Lord, as your children who know what it is to be forgiven, would you help us now to extend that gift to others? Would you help us to be slow to anger and quick to forgive? We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.